this video is part 3 in a series decoding the film Don't Worry, Darling. For those of you who are new to my channel, I decode film, television, and news stories to reveal the hidden meaning within each, that every story is an allegory for the Kundalini awakening. It's important you know this because Kundalini awakening is our entire reason for being here. It's the only way out of this physical realm, our 911 trauma center. In part 1, I discussed the battle between the sexes. In part 2, I showed how this is Alice's world. Also, in part 2, I explained the meaning behind the earthquakes. If you have not yet seen those videos, I encourage you to do so as each video builds on the preceding ones. In part 3, I discuss Margaret and the Red Plane. We are introduced to Margaret, Alice's neighbor, when Alice experiences her first link to the other side. Alice has started humming Jack's tune, possibly connected to the earthquake that occurred that morning. This tune is a song Jack sings to her from the other side, from the real world. When we first see Margaret, she seems to be meditating on her lawn holding a red toy plane. Triggered by the sight of the plane, Alice has her first flashback from the real world. It is of a face wearing the eyepiece, which is the device that puts her into the simulation. At the time that we meet Margaret, she is going through a mental disturbance. Bunny and Alice discuss that Margaret was not at dance class that morning, but Alice's new neighbor Violet was. Bunny adds that she saw Dr. Collins at Margaret's house again. This is the first reference we have to Margaret being crazy. At Frank's house, during the party to welcome the newcomers, Margaret interrupts the party asking why they are here. She's quickly carted off by her husband, and Frank deflects her question so the others at the party are not disturbed by Margaret's ramblings. He also makes her appear to be crazy or a lunatic. A little later at the party, Alice wanders off in search of Jack, and on the way comes across Margaret once again. Margaret warns Alice that she has bad dreams and they are hiding her in here. Her husband hands her pills, which she refuses. He closes the curtain on her, and Alice keeps moving. After the party, the ladies gather at a fashion show and discuss Margaret's odd behavior at the party, to which Bunny mentions that they used to be friends with Margaret until she lost her mind. This is another reference to Margaret being a lunatic. Bunny said Margaret is to blame because she went against the rules and took her son into the desert. The Victory people are told it's dangerous to go past the boundary, but one must break the rules to find the truth. Face the fear because then we will find that the fear is just an illusion. Bunny then repeats another Victory Project mantra, we have to stay where it's safe, which directly connects with the 2020 pandemic slogan, stay safe. Staying safe is another form of keep calm, carry on. These slogans keep people in line by reminding them that there is something to fear. Margaret going into the desert seems to be common knowledge, so clearly they didn't try to cover it up. Margaret claims they took her son to punish her, but children are not real in the simulation. Taking away a woman's child is torture that would drive any loving mother insane. It seems as though Margaret is being used as a warning to the Victory people. They want everyone to know that it's possible to go out there, but if you do, you will be treated like Margaret. This conversation triggers another flashback for Alice that melds into a nightmare, and she wakes up in bed panicking. Margaret told Alice at the party that she too had nightmares. I will explain later the events leading up to the plane crash, but I cannot discuss Margaret without discussing the plane. Alice has an impulse to go for a joyride on the trolley just to get some fresh air and to get out of the house. As the trolley nears the end of the line, Alice sees a red plane. The trolley driver says he does not see the plane. The plane flies overhead, hitting an invisible barrier, which warps the image of the plane. This symbolizes the invisible barrier created by fear that keeps them penned in the Victory Project. The electromagnetic barrier of the torus field in which we live, the edge of the dream. This barrier has been shown to us in other films such as The Truman Show and Free Guy. The red plane penetrating the barrier encourages Alice to step outside of her fear. The driver didn't see a plane because there is no plane. Alice has projected the plane into her experience from her subconscious to trigger her own awakening. The red plane was connected to Margaret, and it triggered a memory in Alice when she first saw it. Why would the plane trigger a memory unless the plane meant something to her from her real life. Alice is triggered to recall images of her real life when she sees Margaret holding the red plane. The second trigger happens while the ladies discuss Margaret going out to the desert, and Alice has a flashback to Margaret with the plane and her son in the desert. Why would Alice have memories of Margaret in the desert with the boy and the plane? It's not a flashback for the viewer, as that would be inconsistent with the rest of the flashbacks in the film. And you can see Alice going into herself a moment before the memory strikes. Margaret never said she saw a plane. No one ever linked a plane to Margaret other than Alice. There was no plane in the desert. It was all in Alice's mind. But it did lead her to the tower, which was the point of the plane. Margaret used the plane to help guide Alice and to trigger her. So the plane must have some meaning to Alice, which means it must be connected to trauma, because this is what Margaret uses to trigger Alice's memories. It's as if Alice is using Margaret to lead herself through the maze, and now Alice is following in Margaret's footsteps. Margaret later calls Alice, saying she knows Alice went into the desert and saw it, meaning the headquarters, but Alice didn't tell anyone, so how did she know? Alice tells Margaret she's talking crazy and hangs up on her, which is exactly what Bunny does to Alice when Alice tries to tell Bunny there's something wrong with this place. Bunny eventually tells Alice she's becoming exactly like Margaret. So if Alice is present tense and Margaret is leading the way out, then Bunny is showing her what her life would be if Alice stayed in the simulation. Then Margaret symbolizes Alice's past self, or what has already happened. And Bunny symbolizes Alice's future self, or what is to come. It's well known that Margaret's son was taken from her, but Alice has no children, which is seen as unusual in the simulation, and her excuse is that she and Jack just want to enjoy each other. Bunny has 2 children, but she told Alice her children were dead in the real world. The night of the 20s promotion party, Jack suggests to Alice that they try for a baby. If Margaret represents Alice that has already been, and Bunny represents the version of Alice that is to come, then it would make sense that if Alice chose to stay, she would have children, and Bunny's statement that her children were dead would also make sense because Margaret's son was dead. This could also suggest that Alice lost a child in the real world, which is why the plane is such a trigger for her, and why she and Jack do not have children in the simulation and just want to enjoy each other. The simulation is a form of escape from the real world. So if their dead child is too much of a bad memory, then Jack wouldn't want to have that reminder in the simulation. But Alice has projected it onto Margaret and Bunny as past and future versions of herself. Following the plane incident, Alice returns to her normal routine, cleaning windows while listening to Frank. And Frank says, "I can't protect you without your loyalty. Is your word your bond, your truth? Do you keep your promise?" Suddenly, Alice feels squeezed between the wall and the window. This scene came directly after Alice confronted Jack about her experience in the desert, and she called her experience a bad dream. Margaret warned Alice at Frank's party that she had bad dreams. A bad dream is also called a nightmare. A mare is a horse, and the part of the brain that is connected to memory is the hippocampus, which means horse or sea monster. This is when Margaret calls Alice and says, "You saw it. They're lying to all of us. We can't stay here. We have to leave." Now, why would Margaret care if Alice leaves? Why doesn't Margaret just leave? Because Margaret doesn't exist outside Alice's mind. Margaret is a mind projection of Alice's, warning her to wake up. Margaret represents the moon, the emotions. In the Anunnaki mythology, the moon is a masculine god called Nanar Sin, but in Roman and Greek mythology, she is a feminine goddess. Diana or Artemis are the moon goddesses, but there are also personifications of the moon named Selene, Mene, or Luna. As I mentioned earlier, there were multiple references to Margaret being a lunatic or crazy. This also connects to the moon. The name Apollo is Greek. They say that he is the sun, and Diana, Artemis, they identify with the moon. The name Luna is derived from lucere, to shine, for it is the same word as Lucina, and therefore in our country, Juno Lucina is invoked in childbirth, as is Diana in her manifestation as Lucifera, the light bringer among the Greeks. She is also called Diana Omnivaga, wide wandering, not from her hunting, but because she's counted as one of the 7 wandering planets, wanderers, vagary. She was called Diana because she made a sort of day, dia, in the nighttime. She is invoked to assist at the birth of children because the period of gestation is either occasionally 7 or more, usually 9, lunar revolutions. These are called the menses, months, because they cover measured mensa spaces. This is from Cicero. The moon tarot represents intuition, dreams, unconscious. It only slightly illuminates the path to the higher consciousness. It represents the watery, subconscious mind, and the crayfish crawling out of the pool symbolizes the early stages of consciousness unfolding. This relates back to what I said about the meaning of the earthquakes, the early stages of consciousness unfolding, the rumblings of Kundalini awakening. It symbolizes illusion, fear, anxiety, subconscious, and intuition. And I was discussing this with Adam in Discord, and he associated Margaret with the amygdala, which makes perfect sense, as Margaret is a loose anagram of amygdala or Mary Magdalene. But more importantly, the amygdala is in charge of emotions, predominantly the more extreme emotions, such as fear. The amygdala is a pair of almond-shaped glands, one in either hemisphere of the brain, that triggers a response to extreme emotion. One side reacts to positive and the other negative, sending messages to the hippocampus to be stored as memory or to trigger memories, and it sends messages to the thalamus. As I showed in part 1, the thalamus is the egg-shaped gland that relays senses and regulates consciousness and sleep. According to harvardhealth.edu, the amygdala is part of the command center. When it perceives danger, it instantly sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus, communicating with the rest of the body through the nervous system so the person has the energy to fight or flee. The autonomic nervous system has 2 components, the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system functions like a gas pedal in a car. It triggers the fight or flight response, providing the body with a burst of energy so it can respond to perceived dangers. After the amygdala sends a distress signal, the hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system by sending signals through the autonomic nerves to the adrenal glands. These glands respond by pumping the hormone epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, into the bloodstream. As the initial surge of epinephrine subsides, the hypothalamus activates a second component of the stress response system, known as the HPA axis. This network consists of the hypothalamus, the pituitary glands, and the adrenal glands. The HPA axis relies on a series of hormonal signals to keep the sympathetic nervous system, the gas pedal, pressed down. If the brain continues to perceive something as dangerous, the hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, CRH, which travels to the pituitary gland, triggering the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. This hormone travels to the adrenal glands, prompting them to release cortisol. The body thus stays revved up and on high alert. When the threat passes, the cortisol levels fall, the parasympathetic nervous system, the brake, then dampens the stress response. Later on, during dance class, Alice spots Margaret in the mirror, acting as her own reflection. Alice plays the mirror game, moving to test whether her reflection is actually connected to her movements until Margaret breaks the pattern, terrifying Alice. This scene is a perfect representation of what Margaret is. She is in the mirror. As I said earlier, Margaret is showing Alice the way out. She is using fear to do it. Margaret first triggered Alice with the red plane. Alice went out into the desert just like Margaret and saw the red plane. Alice followed the plane to the exit. And like Margaret, Alice started having nightmares, memories that scared her because she didn't know what they were. but the fear was triggering her memories and in turn triggering her awakening. The amygdala was triggering her hippocampus and triggering her thalamus. Because no one believed Alice, she buried these experiences and called them nightmares out of fear that others would call her crazy, like they labeled Margaret. So the scene with the mirror in dance class shows how Margaret, the moon, the amygdala, uses fear to trigger memories of the other side to wake us up. Much like in our world, we have the fear produced by the 911 trauma center of the media on the world stage that is designed to wake us up. But this trauma also happens in our own lives through negative experiences. Margaret stops at the mirror, puts her hands on the glass, and smashes her head against it until it breaks. Margaret smashing her head against the glass is symbolic of Alice exiting the simulation at headquarters. Breaking the glass is shattering the illusion of this fake reality because it's all a house of mirrors. Margaret smashes her head against the glass to break it because at headquarters, the tower is surrounded by glass or mirrors on the outside. This triggers Alice's fear that something is wrong with Margaret, and she runs home to find Margaret on the roof of her house. Margaret looks at Alice before ending herself. Alice runs up to help her, but both women are taken away by red men, only Margaret is never to be seen again. So why didn't Margaret go? If she knew how to exit the simulation, why didn't she just leave? Instead, she ended herself in front of Alice, making sure Alice saw. She could have done it quietly so no one knew, but she made sure that Alice saw. Why? Because as I mentioned earlier, Margaret is a mind projection of Alice's. Margaret only exists to serve Alice. She's there to help Alice out of the maze by showing her the way out. Unfortunately, Margaret chose the red exit. Alice must choose the green exit. Why did Margaret choose the red exit? Because Margaret uses fear to move Alice. She is showing Alice what would happen if she doesn't exit through the tower at headquarters. Margaret is a cautionary tale. When Margaret exited through the tower, she must have been put back into the simulation, so she didn't see another way out. So the red men of the Victory Project carted her off and her husband was fired. Bunny later explained that they were killed in the real world, presumably because they knew too much and were a threat to the simulation. But did this actually happen? Or was this all in Alice's mind? And was Margaret actually that much of a threat since Frank told Alice she was the only one to challenge him? Having witnessed this, Alice attempts to follow in Margaret's footsteps once again. However, she can't go through with it, and Dr. Collins comes to visit. Jack tells the doctor about Margaret, but Dr. Collins denies it just like Jack did. He tries to prescribe Alice pills, just like he did to Margaret, but Alice refuses. Collins informs them that Margaret's husband no longer works for the Victory Project. Alice spots Margaret's medical file in his briefcase, which he conveniently leaves behind. But the file is redacted because Margaret doesn't really exist. This is what is to come for Alice if she keeps heading in this direction. Alice burns the file and no one ever says anything about it. This is the last we see of Margaret because her job is done. She got Alice's attention and triggered her to be curious enough to find out the truth behind the Victory Project. This is the end of part 3. There's much more to come, so stay tuned for the next episode. If you like this video, please show your support for my channel. Like, share, subscribe, comment, contribute. Contributions over $15 will receive a link to the Johnny Depp Dark Shadows material, so please be sure to include your email address. Kindly visit my website, subscribe to my backup channels, join the Discord group. All links are in the description box below. Thanks for listening. Hope you're having a great day. Bye for now.